Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
Little is known of the origin and early history of the degree of Royal Arch Mariner. It has been claimed to have been worked from time immemorial, a phrase which, as seen from other orders of Freemasonry, often cannot be substantiated. The earliest reference to the degree in England is at Bath in 1790. The earliest documents, in the possession of the Grand Lodge of Mark Masons of England, are a dispensation authorising the working of the degree dated 1796 and signed by Robert Gill as Acting Commander Noah, and an undated list of officers in the handwriting of Dunkley, with Dunkley himself as commander, which must be earlier than 1796, as Dunkley died in 1795. The Arch Mariner's degree in England came under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Mark Masons in 1870. In Scotland, prior to the formation of the Grand Chapter in 1817, various degrees had been worked under the craft lodges, and afterwards more often in encampments. In 1788 we are told that 2 chapters held their convents at Aberdeen and Glasgow. The Grand Chapter, when formed in 1817, did not clearly designate the degrees which it was to control, and it was not until 1845 that it intimated that the chapters were entitled to grant the following degrees: Mark, Past, Excellent and Royal Arch, as also the Royal Arch Mariners and the Babylonian Pass, commonly called the Red Cross, comprising the 3 points with which we are familiar in the Red Cross of Babylon. In Queensland, the Royal Arch Mariners degree is derived by the Supreme Grand Chapter from the Scottish system under the Supreme Grand Chapter of Scotland, while under the Grand Mark Lodge of Queensland, the degree is as worked under the Grand Mark Lodge of England. There is little difference, however, between the 2 workings. One point to be noticed is that in the English working there is no Bible on the altar, under the thesis that the Bible had not been written at the time of Noah. Its place is therefore taken by the porphyry stone, which Noah used as an anchor, and afterwards as an altar to offer up sacrifice to God for his deliverance. As a practical point of difference, it should be noted that while under the Grand Chapter, the candidate for the Royal Arch Mariners degree must have first received the Royal Arch degree. This is not necessary under the Grand Mark Lodge, as in other constitutions which follow the English system, where the candidate's requirement is that he should be a Mark Master Mason. It is also noticeable that, apart from the porphyry stone of the English working, there is no reference to stonemason's work in the Arch Mariner's degree, which is supposed by some to be much more like a carpenter's degree, or perhaps a shipwright's degree. The working tools are those of a woodworker. There are 2 clear answers to this. In the first place, in early times, and even into the speculative period of Freemasonry, there was not the clear separation of trades, as indicated by the modern saying, one man, one job. Indeed, in the great period of cathedral building, the master masons were capable of turning their hands to any kind of building or artistic work, including wood carving, as well as sculpture in stone, metalwork, and plaster, mosaic, and fresco. Many of the great artists, Michelangelo, Giotto, and many others, were Freemasons at this period, before the artists of Siena broke away from the Freemasons in the 15th century. We can also refer to the description of the master builder of King Solomon's temple. Skillful to work in gold and in silver, in brass, in iron, in stone, and in timber, in purple, in blue, and in fine linen, and in crimson, also to grave any manner of graving, and to find out every device. and in the description of the temple itself in the 6th chapter of the 2nd book of Kings, while the house was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither, it was covered and lined so completely with timber, mostly cedar, and elaborately carved, that there was not one stone seen. The timber, in turn, was covered with plates of gold, even to the carvings, which were covered with gold fitted upon carved work. The second answer to the claim that the Royal Ark mariner's degree appeared to be a carpenter's degree is found in its symbolic relation to the tabernacle and the temples of Solomon and Zerubbabel. All these were built by divine command, and in this succession the ark was the first building erected under divine direction. Thus, the degree of Royal Ark Mariner finds itself in the natural grouping of the Masonic degrees. As the degree of the Royal Ark Mariner is based on the story of Noah and the flood, as found in the 7th and 8th chapters of Genesis, together with the covenant and promise in the 9th chapter, it is tempting to enlarge upon this. When I was young, the belief was widely held that this story was pure legend or myth, but in recent years, the findings of archaeologists in Mesopotamia have shown that in the early history of Ur of Chaldees, the city was inundated by a great flood, which completely wiped out the earlier civilization. It deposited a layer of fresh water clay, varying in thickness from 8 to 14 feet, indicating a flood of exceptionally great magnitude. The civilization which grew up later on the site shows no connection with the former. E.W. Maunder, Astronomer Royal of England during the opening years of this century, has noticed a relation between the ancient figures of the constellations of the stars and the story of the flood, and compares these also with the Babylonian tablets of the deluge story. The constellation figures, although accepted by and usually attributed to the Greeks, he shows to be much older, as many of them appear on Babylonian boundary stones of much earlier age. If we take only the constellations as listed by Aratus and by Ptolemy, the Greek astronomers, we find in the southern sky a great circular area left blank because invisible from northern latitudes. From the extent of this circle, he estimates the designing of the constellation figures to have been made from about 40 degrees north latitude, considerably north of Babylon. The centre of the circle, which at that time must have been the south pole of the sky, is now considerably displaced from the present south pole, owing to the change in the Earth's axis called precession. From the known rate of precession, he has calculated that the constellation figures were set out about 2700 BC. He also pointed out that at that time certain of the constellation figures were clearly designed to mark out astronomical features, such as the equator, the ecliptic, and the colures, marking the position of the sun at spring and autumn equinoxes. They also marked both the north pole of the equator, indicating the direction of the Earth's axis, and the north pole of the ecliptic, around which fixed point in the sky the north pole of the equator precesses in a circle of 23.5 degrees radius, taking, as is now known, about 26,000 years to make the circuit. Of the 48 constellations listed by Aratus, no less than 12, in a part of the sky then visible in late winter or early spring, show features in common with the biblical account of the deluge. A similar agreement of features in common is also seen in the Babylonian deluge tablets. Of the 3 accounts thus compared, only that of the constellation figures can be dated. The general agreement between the main features of the 3 accounts indicates that they are descriptions of the same event. The differences are no less striking, indicating that they are independent accounts. In the constellation figures, he who emerges from the ark is a centaur, now supposed to be a representation of a horseman by a city dweller who knows nothing of horse riding. If we estimate from the development of the story shown by the characters of the differences a period of about 800 to 1,000 years for the stellar representation, we obtain an estimate of the data of the flood, about 3,500 to 3700 BC, therefore in general agreement with the independent estimate of the archaeologists. I have said little about the degree itself. The wisdom, strength, and beauty displayed in the construction of the ark are emblematical of the infinite wisdom, power, and goodness of God, by whose will alone all things exist. When storms overwhelm the ungodly, the righteous are secure. When all the wicked shall perish, the good and faithful shall find rest and safety in the ark. Noah's Ark was not a ship, but a flat-bottomed chest of 3 stories. It was about 500 feet long, 80 feet wide, and 50 feet high, built of gopher or cypress wood, painted inside and out with bitumen or pitch to make it waterproof. When comparatively few species of fauna were known, there was no difficulty in supposing that Noah's Ark was large enough to preserve them all. Sir Walter Raleigh, allowing for some 100 different kinds of animals, was able to show that one floor of the ark could have held them. Another floor, he believed, could have the food, a third the birds, and ample room would still remain for the human occupants. In succeeding centuries, however, the number of species was increased by the thousands, and the matter of the ark became more and more troublesome. Later came the energetic Sumerians, whose culture became the basis of the later Babylonian civilization. Their literature, recovered from the ruins of the city of Nippur, was extensive. Their system of writing, religious beliefs, such as those of the creation and the flood, became the classical inheritance of later Mesopotamian peoples. Sargon, from 2360 to 2180 BC, was Mesopotamia's greatest king. An epic was written about him entitled The King of Battles. Curiously, a story told about him is strikingly similar to the childhood of Moses. We are informed that he was of lowly birth, that his mother bore him in secret, placed him in a reed basket, and set him adrift on the Euphrates. He was rescued by a gardener, adopted, and grew up to become king. It is an interesting fact that the Hebrew stories of the creation and the flood do not resemble anything in either Egyptian or Canaanite literature. This is curious, since Israelites lived for so many years as neighbours of both peoples. In fact, it seems more probable that some of the traditions about the creation, the Garden of Eden, the flood, the stories of Nimrod, Genesis 10 verse 12, and the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, were brought from the Mesopotamia by the patriarchs themselves. How else explain why Israel had them, but Canaan did not? The great Temple Tower, or ziggurat, may have been erected as early as the 4th century BC. In addition, the mountains on which the ark landed in the Babylonian story of the flood were just east of Mesopotamia, while in the Hebrew story they are in the mountains of Ararat, or Armenia, just north of Haran. The story of the tower, then, gives its approximate age, while the story of the flood indicates that we are dealing not with a Babylonian, but with a North Mesopotamian tradition. It is evident, therefore, that the archaeological facts are in agreement with the biblical tradition that the original home of the patriarchs was in the area of Haran. Terah migrated from Ur of the Chaldees, a great Sumerian city near the Persian Gulf. Who then were the patriarchs, and whence did they come? The Babylonian flood is recounted in the Gilgamesh epic, which includes the adventures of Enkidu and Utnapishtim and his wife, who had been warned by the god Ea, built a ship, and saved himself, his wife, and pairs of living things. Many of the Babylonian details are so close to the biblical story that the ultimate dependence of the latter upon the former seems clear. Not only the general outline of the story, but the building of the ship, the release of the birds at the end of the flood, including the dove and the raven — the Babylonian story also has a swallow — and the sacrifices of the flood hero after the boat had landed on some mountains, are common to both accounts. The differences between the two are, first, that the Babylonian ship landed in the Zagros Mountains to the east of Mesopotamia, while the biblical ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat, which is Armenia. Thus, the Genesis story is probably based upon a northern Mesopotamian version. Secondly, the polytheism of the Babylonian account is a typical feature. After the flood was underway, even the gods feared it, climbing to the highest heaven and, crouched like dogs, cowering at the bulwark of the heavens. After the flood subsided, the gods, who had been so long without food, are said to have smelled the sweet savour of the hero's sacrifice and gathered like flies over it. Thirdly, the whole meaning of the two stories differ in their settings. In the biblical story, the flood is no longer a rash and irresponsible act, but the illustration of the righteousness of God, who acts in history to destroy sinners, though he preserves his remnant for a new beginning. Thus, to me, the Ark Mariner's degree has a great spiritual significance, and Noah's prayer is very enlightening.
For more Masonic podcasts, videos, music, texts, and artwork, visit fromthequarries.com or subscribe to our YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook accounts by searching From the Quarries.